All right, well, hello everyone. My name's Caleb Southern. I'm a senior history major here at Southern Wesleyan. I'm graduating in just a couple weeks. So the title of my project was Rival Team, the Leadership of Jefferson Davis in the Confederate Executive Cabinet. So my presentation is a series of questions to get you engaged as to why you should care about this. So the first question you might have is, where did this all begin? So we're going to look at my inspiration for where my topic came from, and there are three works in particular that brought me to this topic. The first was historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. She wrote a book called Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln, published in 2005. And it was very popular. It's still one of the first books to come up on Amazon if you search Abraham Lincoln. Not that any of y'all do that. I do. In this work, her essential argument was that Lincoln displayed political mastery by assembling and then successfully controlling a cabinet composed of his chief rivals for the Republican nomination in 1860. The second work was historian Brian R. Dirk. He wrote a book about Lincoln and Davis's nationalism, published in 2001. Lincoln and Davis, Imagining America, argues that we should strike a balance between these men's national visions. And the significant thing about his work is that he doesn't give a lot of, he doesn't pay a lot of attention to the fact that the Confederacy lost the war, because he thinks that a lot of times we are blinded and just assume that everything that they did was negative because they're lost, they're the losers of history. And he also renders slavery as one of many social, cultural, political, and psychological issues of the period. So sometimes that can be a little blinding to historians as well. James M. McPherson, he published his acclaimed and essential Battle Cry of Freedom in 1988 as part of the Oxford University History of the United States. And he argues for, in explaining Confederate defeat, he argues for contingency, recognizing that at numerous times during the war, things could have turned out completely different based on decisions being made by people at all levels of government and military, from straight down to civilians. So. All right, so these works led me to wonder about leadership in the Civil War. Have we misinterpreted it based on preconceived opinions due to the war's outcome or due to our own time's opinion of slavery? And specifically, I asked these questions. Was Jefferson Davis's cabinet weaker than Lincoln's as an institution? Does Davis's interactions with his cabinet secretaries indicate that he was a poor leader? And then, as kind of a subset of that question, what is the validity of the four common criticisms of the Davis cabinet? So the first is that he selected poor men to fill the offices, or the men that he did select that might have been qualified were put in the wrong position. Second question, or second criticism, the cabinet had a high turnover rate, which reduced consistency. So in 4 years, Davis had 14 men to fill 6 posts. Third criticism, the secretaries were merely glorified clerks with no actual power. They didn't have any freedom to operate in their own department. And the fourth criticism is that Davis was difficult to get along with and did not have political savvy in dealing particularly with his opponents. So what's the history that you need to know here? And I'm going to focus on the cabinet, assuming that you have a basic knowledge of the Civil War as far as the outcome goes. I'll tell you that later, Paul. The outcome and whatnot. So these next two slides is the first cabinet that that Davis appointed. So these men filled the original post. And notice as we go through, there is a person from each state. And that was part of Davis's operating procedure, was he was trying to bring a person from every state to unite each individual state behind the Confederate national government. So in the State Department, Robert A. Toombs of Georgia, Treasury had Christopher Gustavus Memminger of South Carolina. The War Department had Leroy Pope Walker from Alabama. And then on this slide, these three men I put on a separate slide because they actually served, they were the only secretaries to serve for the entirety of the war. They never left the cabinet. So Attorney General was Judah Philip Benjamin, Secretary of Navy Stephen Russell Mallory, and then the Postmaster General was John Henninger Reagan of Texas, Florida, and Louisiana. Respectfully in reverse. So then in my paper what I did was I examined each of I called it the triumvirate. So the three important departments in the cabinet are the State Department, which deals with foreign affairs, the Treasury Department, which deals with finances, and then the War Department, now the Department of Defense, which deals with the country's defense. So we'll look at each of those, and then I looked at each of the three members together as a unit that stayed for the whole time. So in the State Department, Toombs was the first secretary, and he was Davis's chief rival for the position of the presidency. And they didn't get along very well, and he left for the military. He left for a military appointment. Robert M.T. Hunter served second, and he left the office to serve in Congress. And then Judah Philip Benjamin was moved to the department, and he served for the rest of the war. So notice how long Benjamin served. He served for a majority of the war, 1862 to 65. And the first two secretaries left after mere months in office, so they weren't in the office very long. But also notice that other things drew them away from their department, not just conflicts with Davis. In the Treasury Department, notice here there's only two secretaries. And notice how long Memminger served, well into 1864. So a majority of the war. And Memminger came highly recommended by the South Carolina delegation, and he was actually on the South Carolina House of Representatives Budgeting Committee. And then Trenholm, George A. Trenholm, was a wealthy businessman, probably the wealthiest man in the entire Confederacy, and he consulted with Memminger while Memminger was Secretary of the Treasury. So there wasn't a lot of policy turnover when Trenholm took the office. Now, the War Department, you'll see that we have a much higher turnover rate here. Notice 5 secretaries. James Alexander Seaton, there toward the end, he served the longest, so 1862 to 65 there. They all left for different reasons. Walker left to join the military. Benjamin was unpopular. He couldn't deal well with the military commanders, and he was a Jew, which made him automatically unpopular at the racist Confederacy. And he was moved to the State Department from the War Department. And then Randolph is one of the only secretaries that actually tried to grab power from Davis. He tried to appoint a military, like a sergeant or a lieutenant, and Davis did not appreciate not being notified. So they had a little tizzy, and he was forced out of the cabinet. But he did join the military after he left over kind of the power grab there. And so then these three I've labeled as the committed. Judah Benjamin served in 3 departments: Attorney General, War, and then State. And then Mallory stayed in the Navy. He was probably Davis's most successful and best appointment. He was very innovative. He created ironclads, which were wooden ships that had metal plating, and they were practically undefeatable. They actually beat the Union to that. And then Postmaster General Reagan, he stayed till the bitter end. He was arrested or captured with Davis in Georgia. The other men resigned before they were captured. And he was required by the Confederate Constitution to get the Postal Service to operate in the black by March 1st of 1863, and he successfully did that. It's the only time in American history that the National Postal Service has ever operated out of debt in a time of war. So that's pretty impressive. And these men were fiercely loyal to Davis, and they sacrificed their own ambition a lot of times for Confederate nationalism. So that was very popular to Davis, as we'll see. So what did I do to conduct this research? I received grant funding from SCICU and South Carolina Humanities, and then I planned a trip and traveled to the major stops I stopped at were Texas, Mississippi, and then Virginia. So I have a couple pictures. So on your left there, that's the first White House of the Confederacy in Montgomery, Alabama. So I stopped there on my way to Texas. I got to tour that. That is on the right there is Fondren Library at Rice University in Houston, Texas. It houses all of Jefferson Davis's papers there at the Woodson Research Center. Left there, and then at the right there I am with my computer, my now deceased Mac, with the boxes. That's the Confederate imprint collection. So at Rice they have at Jefferson Davis's actual letters, and then also the Confederate imprint collection, which is when the Confederate government would have their official documents typed up for the Congress. And so these are some of Davis's letters that I got to touch without gloves and take pictures of at will, so you can see them there. That one actually has a transcript there on the right, but I was taking some notes there for that. That woman there is Linda Christ. She is the editor of Jefferson Davis's papers. So I actually got to meet Linda Christ. That means nothing to you, but it was very exciting for me. She has published, with the help of the University of Louisiana, all 14 volumes of all of his papers. So she gave me a lot of their resources in the library. She was able to help me find those. That is Jefferson Davis's Presidential Library and Museum. At the top there, it's not much, but I went in Biloxi, Mississippi, right on the coast, and then that's his house boudoir, where he wrote his memoirs in. And it's right on the beach. If you turn around from where I'm standing, you can literally, there's a road and then the beach. It was nice. So. That's the Library of Congress on the left. I stopped in D.C. on my way back up to Virginia, or to Richmond, and I was going to see some of their Confederate documents. I had been emailing them and contacting them, but they hadn't really got back to me, so I showed up. I did get a Library of Congress library card, and then they sent me through the underground labyrinth, so I felt like I was on National Treasure. And I made it to their manuscript collection, and they said, well, it's mostly digitized, and you have to have like an actual important project to be able to view these. And I was like, all right, so I left, but it was a fun time. So there's the Library of Congress, and then that is the White House of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia. So the Confederate government started out in Montgomery, and then they moved north to Virginia to Richmond after Virginia seceded. So I got to see some of the historic sites there. So what was the result of this research? What are my conclusions? So I'll look at each of the 4 criticisms of the cabinet to determine their validity, and then I pulled out what I think are 6 leadership lessons that we can learn from Jefferson Davis and his interactions with his cabinet. So first, the criticism that he poorly selected individuals. He did choose men of ability, from what I could find. Few of the officers that he chose had previously been national figures in the United States government, but they were well known within their state. That's not unusual for that period in the South. Some historians have criticized that none of the cabinet officers inspired nationalism or a national identity in the South. And my question to them is, well, when has this ever been the case? No one would point to anyone in Lincoln's cabinet and say, no one remembers Edwin McMaster Stanton and says, what a great national figure, or William Henry Seward. No one remembers these figures as inspiring nationalism, so why should we expect the same thing from Davis's cabinet? And Davis's mode of operation for choosing his cabinet and the entire selection process were not dissimilar from Lincoln's. They actually were very similar. The idea of having political and geographical representation from around the country. The turnover rate is probably the most accurate of the criticisms, but if you break it down and compare, Davis in 4 years had 14 men at 6 posts. Lincoln had 4 years. He had 13 men fill 7 posts. If you remove the Interior Department, which the Confederacy did not have because it represented government overreach to them, then you have 11 men filling 6 posts. So it's probably not a very significant difference, or statistically significant difference there. But if you examine it department by department, it is even more, it puts things even more perspective. In the State Department, Davis had 3 Secretaries of State to Lincoln's 1. Treasury, Davis had 2 to Lincoln's 3. They both had 1 Navy Secretary. And then in the War Department, you had 5 to Davis, 5 for Davis and 2 to Lincoln. And most of the officers that had a significant impact served for a majority of the war, and those that left only stayed in the department for a couple of months. They weren't there long enough to really do a lot of damage, so to speak. The idea that they were simply glorified clerks with no real power, or that Davis was a micromanager. We can see this a lot in the War Department, but I argue that this was the major policy area of the period, because the Confederacy was born in a state of war. And the secretaries left for other reasons besides the fact that they didn't have enough power. The military attracted people away, as well as political opportunities in Congress. The daily business of the departments were left to the cabinet officers. I found that Davis left the Capitol very often, which is surprising in that period without immediate communication, that he would actually physically leave the Capitol where all the business is happening. And actually, Judah Benjamin, Secretary of State at the time, he called a cabinet meeting by his own authority, and they voted to eject British consul representatives from the country. That's a pretty big deal, and they only got Davis's approval afterward. So he wasn't as much of a micromanager, I think, as has often been told to us. And the officers did disagree with Davis in cabinet discussions, especially John Reagan in his memoirs. He was very proud of the fact that he disagreed with Davis the most. So it's evidence that he didn't stifle discussion. He wasn't a dictator, so to speak. And then his personality, he got along well with friends and supporters. The thing about studying Davis is you often have kind of a dichotomy of the descriptions of him. They either loved him or they hated him. So his friends and supporters really had positive things to say. He could be dismissive toward his enemies, and he really disliked dissent or petty squabbles because he couldn't understand why people wouldn't sacrifice everything like he had for the cause. He was a far-sighted nationalistic visionary, so that was good for his country at that time. And his personality, if we're going to limit it to the cabinet, rarely interfered with the operations of the cabinet, mainly because they were mostly his friends. So, not his friends, but he got along with them. So then 6 leadership lessons that I think we can learn from Davis. Communication is key. Davis had an obligation to communicate the goals of his administration to the nation, but also to communicate boundaries of power within the departments, which he may or may not have done as best as he could. But communication. 2, commitment to a single vision or goal. And in this way, I think his cabinet was better than Lincoln's cabinet, hence the name, instead of team of rivals, rival team. They operated better as a team. They had one goal in mind. There was a lot of infighting in the Lincoln cabinet. You know, was this war about slavery? Was this war about keeping the Union together? Are we going to bring the South in as states? Are we going to make it one million? There's a lot of different goals there, and they couldn't agree. In Davis's cabinet, they were always operating toward one goal: independence. And I think that shows us that there's got to be commitment to single vision or a goal, especially in times of crisis. Mutual trust, particularly between the president and secretaries. 4, the president has an obligation to make final decisions, but after responsibly hearing the advice of his cabinet secretaries, which Davis did. He gives direction. The president should give direction, but then leave freedom in details. And then finally, perseverance. Any sort of leader needs to have perseverance, no matter what exactly is going on. So, who cares? Why is this research important? So, I think we're having 2 crises in the United States today. First is a crisis in leadership. I put a picture of President Trump and his Vice President Pence here. I could have easily put a picture of several other past presidents. I think we're lacking in strong visionary leaders or, clear leadership focus. And so some of these things I think can be taken to heart and learned. Second, and a little more controversial, I know, is what I've termed a crisis in memory. And I think that we're at a time when we're in danger of forgetting where we've been. So I think this type of research is important, not to maybe glory or worship some of the things that have happened in our past, but to not forget where we've been and the things that we want to avoid repeating. So what now? So some suggestions for further research that I have, particularly in the cabinet. I think we need, in the Confederate cabinet, more research on the relationship between politics and effectiveness. Lincoln and Davis had members from both the Democrats and the Whigs. They had members of both political parties in their cabinets. So what is the corollary there between the different party representatives and the effectiveness of the cabinet? So did those parties clash at all to hinder effectiveness, essentially? We definitely need more biographies of the individual cabinet officers. James Seaton, the Secretary of War who served in Davis's cabinet the longest, he has no biography at all. I had to go to encyclopedias to find biographical information on him. He has no full-length biography. And that's important to understand people, their struggles, their sins, so to speak, and it helps us understand why they did things the way that they did to get a better picture. So what effect did the cabinet have on the Confederate nationalism? That was a criticism that some people had. So did it have any sort of nationalizing effect, having all of those states represented at first? And then I think it would be good if there was a comparative study with the Davis cabinet and the other American war cabinets. So President Madison in the War of 1812, or Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet during World War II, Wilson's cabinet in World War I. You know, what other things can we learn by comparing him not only to Lincoln's cabinet, but the way other cabinets have operated? And as far as suggestions for general research in the Civil War field, I think we could use some less simplistic evaluations and conclusions about the Confederate States. Again, not to worship or glorify in the Confederate States, but to understand that it's a more complicated period than sometimes we give them credit for. More research in the cabinet in general in the Confederate government. So I've listed some things there. Its history, its purpose, effectiveness under various presidents, different trends we see throughout history. I think that would be rather interesting. And then I think we would do good to examine Civil War leadership without preconceptions determined by slavery or defeat. So, finally, acknowledgments. Would like to thank God. All search for truth is to bring Him honor and glory, and so I thank Him that He's given me this opportunity, and that I hope that by discovering truth, He is honored and glorified in that. SCICU, South Carolina Humanities for funding, Dr. Ken Myers. For his guidance. My committee, Professor Keaton is here, Bob Black, and Professor Stubblefield, thank you for your advice and feedback. Emily Germain, thanks for letting me hang out in your office sometimes and ask so many questions. Rice University and their librarians were very helpful, thank them. The Sioux librarians, I saw Joni in here, you got a lot of articles for me, thank you for that. I still have that massive folder, so thank you. And then thank you to my family, thank you for giving me the time and the space to research and to write, and the encouragement that I needed at times. So, thank you. Are there any questions, comments, concerns? Yes, Ted.
This cabinet is where did the term cabinet come from? The figure thing is an actual thing. If this cabinet was an actual thing. Just curious, what type of book was this cabinet?
Right. So the cabinet is an institution of chief advisors to the president. They're the heads of different bureaucratic departments in the American government. It comes from the 16th century French word cabine, and it was a room, C-A-B-I-N-E. It was a room where the monarch would go to gamble, and typically his advisors would come with him and they would gamble and talk policy, and from that we get the idea of the cabinet. So. Interestingly to me, the American Constitution does not say that you have to have a cabinet. It says that the president can consult if he wants to the heads of the various departments. And so George Washington decided it would be a good idea if they all met together. And so the idea of the cabinet meeting together and developing policy is totally based on tradition and precedent. It's not stipulated by the Constitution at all. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's very that you knew the answer to that.
Somebody has to. Yes, ma'am.
The cabinet members in the war, there was a larger turnover of that than the others. So do you think it was as a reflection of what was going on in the war? Or?
I do. I think we can see some corollary when your side's losing and you need a scapegoat. And so a lot of times the Secretary of War, whether or not he actually had power or not, because Davis kept a lot of the strategic development power to himself, but they definitely were a scapegoat sometimes. And so I think when things were going poorly and it was an unpopular position. And so that was a lot of Davis's problem, is he couldn't find someone who was willing to take all that heat, essentially for things that they had no control over. So I do think there's a correlation there between the way the war is going and then the department heads leaving. Yes. Good question. Thank you.
You challenged the 4 criticisms that are commonly levied against Davis's cabinet.
Right.
Do you also challenge the starting contention that Davis's cabinet was not as effective as Lincoln's cabinet? If the criticisms are not true, then is the contention that the cabinet was not as effective also not true?
Right. I think that goes back to my challenge for less simplistic evaluations of the Civil War. It's easy to say that, of course, Davis as a president or a leader, or of course his cabinet was not as effective because they lost. But if we go back to McPherson's challenge of contingency, the idea that there were several it's not only Davis and his cabinet making decisions, but it's also officers in the military, it's also quartermaster generals, and it's also that private who decided to desert, or that slave who decided to revolt. There are so many decisions that are being made at any one time. So I do think that there is, can we say that his cabinet was any less effective? I don't know. I would also say that in some ways it was better. As my title suggested, that they acted more as a team, united behind a single vision, whereas there was a lot of infighting, a lot at times of Lincoln's cabinet. So I do think that there's something there to be said for that. So, yes, Mr.
How long before your book shows up on Amazon?
I have no idea, but I'll let you know.
Just remember Smooth Honors.
Okay, I will.
You wrote in your summation that I sought to determine whether Lincoln was truly a superior leader by examining Jefferson. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Right, so essentially being killed by a president basically makes you a god in the American political religion, and so Lincoln, it's difficult to find any literature or scholarship that's not immediately hated that's about Lincoln, because that's negative toward Lincoln, because he's so often praised in scholarship for saving the United States. And so sometimes I wonder if he's placed too high on pedestals. And it's again, it goes back to that simplistic evaluation of, Lincoln's the good guy and Davis is the bad guy. And so my contention there was that maybe they're just two different, they were two different types of leaders. Is Davis, like Davis's personality type, is that a more negative type of person compared to Lincoln as a type of person? Does that make sense? Like, Davis lost, so everything about him or his government or the people that ran that department is negative. So, did I answer your question at all? Is that fine?
I'm going to rescue you.
Okay, great, thanks. Appreciate it.
Give a round of applause.